Hi there, I'm Dr. Jill Wener. I am a doctor turned expert in physician wellness, and I teach meditation and tapping. And I also have a course on anti-racism, um, and have been doing this series of interview during COVID to help bring to attention issues that have been in place before COVID that are now being magnified by COVID in terms of healthcare disparities and other disparities in our country for marginalized people. And so I am so grateful to have Kosha Tucker here today. She's a staff attorney at the ACLU of Georgia, and she's heading up a project that is asking for the release of people who are 62 and older from prison. And I'll have her talk more about why and the background, and if that doesn't make sense, what that actually is. So Kosha, thank you so much for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you here with me. It's on my show. It's not even a show, but whatever this is. So if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe what got you into doing activism work, and what projects you're working on right now at the ACLU.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I am Kosha Tucker. I am a staff attorney at the ACLU of Georgia. But before coming to the ACLU of Georgia, and honestly, what brought me here was my work as a public defender for 6 years in DeKalb County, Georgia. I started my legal career as a fellow at Emory Law School, working with their Child Law and Policy Center, the Barton Child Law and Policy Center. But I knew going into law school that I wanted to be a public defender. I knew I wanted to work on behalf of people with whom I identified personally as a Black woman who grew up in rural North Carolina in poverty, and with a father who had his own troubles with the law when I was a child. And I saw the systemic racism present in my personal life and knew that if I was one day privileged to use power and pedigree, to be honest, I would do that on behalf of people and my family. And so I went to law school, became a public defender, and then came to the ACLU of Georgia when I learned about the criminal law reform work that was happening nationally with the ACLU and statewide in Georgia. I thought I could bring my experience as a public defender to this impact litigation or impact policy work that was happening for criminal law reform.
Great. Wow, that's so powerful. So you've had your own experience with it and then brought that into your professional work. I feel like a lot of people have these noble ambitions when they first start, and they're like, I want to be a doctor to do this, or a lawyer to do this, and then they get like sucked into the machine.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
And so I'm kudos to you for actually sticking with it and doing the work you do, because a lot of people forget those.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I feel pretty privileged to have been able to make the choice. It's not easy doing the work, and I think when you are a marginalized person yourself with intersecting oppressive identities,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to then do the work 9 to 5 when you live it, right? When you live through these oppressive regimes and systems. And luckily, though, I have a very supportive partner and family and friends to help me sustain the work.
Can you talk a little bit about intersecting issues? Because I've learned about that in my own work, and that might not make implicit, like inherent sense to people who are watching this who haven't like read books or whatever. So can you talk about the way that plays out in the US?
Yeah, so I think of intersecting identities to mean a person is more than what is more than one thing, more than one identity. And the ways in which those identities intersect give you a different experience as you walk through the world. And I can speak from my experience as a Black person who also happens to be a woman who was born in rural North Carolina. So already I have obstacles and perhaps even certain benefits because I am Black or because I am a woman. And so when I enter a room or walk down the street, the way people receive me is going to be based on whatever kinds of understandings, rightfully or wrongfully, they have about women or about Black people or about people from the South or people who grew up in a rural community. I also, though, I have a lot of education privilege, and that intersects as well. You know, I am marginalized in a lot of respects as a Black woman who grew up in poverty, but then I had the very fortunate opportunity to go to good schools, undergrad and law school. And so I bring with that a certain level of privilege when I go back home and I meet with friends who are from my small town. I know that I'm coming back home as a person who went to these fancy institutions, and I'm not returning to this environment that is somewhat foreign to me. And so balancing all of that, walking through the world, I think gives me a certain perspective, as it would anyone else with their different identities, gives them a certain perspective of how they've been treated, or where they've gone, or what they've been exposed to, or the conversations people are willing to have with them. We all have these perspectives to a conversation that, in my opinion, enriches that conversation.
Great. So thank you so much for that that explanation. And I think that learning the way that they all intersect is really important, because as for me, I'm obviously white and I'm obviously a woman, but I experience certain things as being a woman in the world, but obviously have no idea what it's like to be a person of color in the world. And so everything is very different. And then you have, sexual, identity and gender identity and all of those different things. And they all intersect. So thank you for explaining that. So can you talk a little bit about what's going on, a little bit of pre-COVID? What are some of the human rights issues in jails and prisons? And then we'll talk about COVID after that.
Yeah, sure. So nationally, we are having this conversation about the problem of mass incarceration and the sort of inherent racism present in our current criminal legal system, and honestly, our entire criminal legal system from the end of slavery until present day. It isn't even about the current system necessarily. This is a system that's been in place for a long time, that has been born out of white supremacy. But nationally, we're now having this conversation about how racist that system is. And in Georgia in particular, where we lead the nation with the number of people who are under correctional control. We lead the nation for the amount of people who are in prison, in jails, on probation, and under community supervision. So that means people are being controlled by these criminal systems for very long periods of time, often for nonviolent offenses. And so the question is this system broken? And I think in Georgia, under Governor Deal, there was starting to be some movement around, and some bipartisan effort around, how to fix this broken system, either from a financial standpoint, right? It's costing the state a lot of money to house people in custody, and also to continue to employ people to supervise them in the community. And then to see recidivism continue to go up. So from a financial standpoint, it's not cost effective. But then, of course, from the human rights standpoint, it's cruel to put people under these oppressive regimes and expect them to be able to re-enter society and not return back to jail or back to prison or back to probation, especially when the root causes of some of these issues aren't being addressed. So even before COVID, there were concerns that we were putting too many people in jail, putting too many people in prison, and putting too many people on leave and setting them up for failure. I think now, under the COVID crisis, that's all coming to a head. We are seeing that the system of yesterday, of the past, that we were still, for some reason, continuing to prop up, fails when there is a crisis like this. And I think we can all begin to, we can reflect on what those failures are, and how we can return post-COVID to a better system that actually works and is fair and equitable.
So what are some of the ways that COVID has been amplifying the system?
Yeah. So what we
problems with the system.
Yep. So when you have an exploding mass incarceration problem, exploding number of people under correctional control, and you have a crisis like COVID comes in that requires you to socially distance, it requires you to self-quarantine and to stay away from other people, that is impossible in a corrections environment. You can't stay 6 feet apart from people. You can't self-quarantine and wash your hands as frequently as you would like, or use hand sanitizer as frequently as you would like, or practice any of the hygiene instructions that we've been told to. And that's the problem, right? We wouldn't have this concern that there are too many people in jails and prisons who can't distance themselves and practice safe hygiene practices if there weren't so many people there just physically present in these facilities. And perhaps if the facilities, you know, I might argue that maybe we never need to put human beings in cages, but, you know, separate and apart from that argument, you can imagine, and I'm sure the Department of Corrections, the Georgia Department of Corrections and county sheriffs can imagine how much easier it would be for them to maintain and prevent the spread of COVID if they had facilities that weren't filled with so many people.
I was just talking with Chris Bruce, who's the political director of the ACLU, and he was saying that there's currently 98 staff who have been infected and 294 people who are incarcerated who have been infected, and that's just as of now, which is early May.
And that's just in the prisons, right? That's just in the Department of Corrections facilities.
So that's just the very beginning, or the tip of the iceberg, or just a section of it. So I have two. Okay, I want to go into COVID. I want to go into all the great work you're doing, but there are going to be people who are going to say, yeah, but these people committed crimes. They deserve to be punished. And if they're all Black people, then they're all Black people because they've done the crimes. I don't believe this, but I would love to hear what you say to people who say that. I've been asking a lot of those questions in these interviews because I'd like to try to like imagine what people watching these videos might be thinking. So can you help like explain how it is that systemic racism isn't just this, like, it's real, and how that has played into putting more people of color into jail and prison?
Yeah, that's a big question, but I think that one of the things that happened in the days of the internet with viral hashtags, for example, that I think illustrates the racial disparities that are present in the criminal system, which leads me to say that the system is racist, was this hashtag called criming while white. It went viral some years ago, and it was white people who were posting tweets or Facebook posts outing themselves for the crimes that they had committed that they never got caught for. They never got arrested, they never got prosecuted. No one even knew that they had done it because no one was looking for them. And I think that what was illustrative about the point was many of us, myself included, have engaged in what is technically criminal behavior. I mean, if you've sped, if you've violated the speed limit, that's a misdemeanor in Georgia. So it's interesting to me how people categorize what's a crime, when it is a crime, depending on who is doing it, and then what that person deserves, or what kind of accountability is necessary for that particular person who commits the crime. So you do have examples, and this is not the answer, but you have examples where people of color will be arrested for behaviors that white people can commit with impunity. They never get caught, they're never going to be prosecuted. Marijuana is like the classic example of that thing. Most of the people I knew in college and currently who smoke marijuana are white. None of them are going to see the inside of a jail cell. It'd be very rare for them to be caught doing what they are doing. And one of the reasons why is that they can do it in the privacy of their own homes. White people tend to not live in communities that are over-policed. They're not living in apartment complexes that are for people with low income, which again are over-policed. And so you can sort of do the things in the privacy of your home that the police are never going to know about. And they would if they were in a different neighborhood. So that's one example. The other way,
or they'll be like, oh, it's just, you were just misbehaving.
Right. You're just young and dumb. I was a public defender in juvenile court, and you saw this a lot, where Black teenage boys were not allowed to engage in childish tomfoolery, right? They couldn't be out after dark or roaming about a park or, trying to smoke behind a tree, the things that teenagers kind of do behind their parents' backs, they were going to get arrested. They looked suspicious if they were doing that. Whereas I had very few white clients, but I would have people in my church, for example, give me examples of the things their kids had done growing up. And they were just like, yeah, they were just being stupid teenagers. I wouldn't want them to go to jail for that, right?
Wow.
But then I think you also, so those are, I still think the person that you have in mind who might ask this question, but how is this racist, still might respond to what I just said and say, yeah, but that's minor stuff. Of course, I can agree. I might be able to agree with you, Kosha, that Black people should stop being arrested for marijuana, right? Okay, so we agree on that, but like, what about the murders and the robberies and, serious crimes that are a threat to our safety? And honestly, I think that my response to that is, I think people would be surprised to know what amounts to a robbery or an aggravated assault. You read those words on paper and they sound awful. What you imagine happened in that incident was scary and violent, and sometimes they are, but many times what happened in real life compared to what is written on the indictment are not what they seem, right? And so it's easy to paint people as monsters who committed these offenses when you don't know them, when you've never talked to them, when you didn't get the full story, and all you're hearing is what the police report said, or what some sensationalized news story reported. And when I was a public defender, I had to sit down with people and learn about them as human beings, not just a name on a piece of paper or some allegations or charges on an accusation or indictment or police report. I got to talk to them as humans. And I think if more people were introduced to the human beings behind these numbers and behind these charges and behind these alleged crimes, it would be very hard for them to think that those people deserve to go spend significant portions of their lives behind bars. And I think that many people who are in prison and jails are there for offenses that would, I think if people knew what it was like to spend a day in jail, they wouldn't want to sentence anyone to 10 years in a prison.
And so a lot of people don't understand that like jail is where you go before you're sentenced, and
right.
Prison is where you go once you actually have it. But you can be in jail for years.
You could.
And not even have a trial date, right? I mean, there's all sorts of crazy, ridiculous human rights violations that go into that. Are there data available, or is that something I didn't ask you to prepare this, so I don't want to put you on the spot, but how long do people, are there racial disparities in how long people spend in jail before they have a trial? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there are. And I think that the disparities too stem from poverty. So often people who are serving pre-trial detention are there because they just can't afford the bond that's been set for them. And when it's a misdemeanor, people are in Georgia anyway, you are entitled to bond. So it really is a matter of the court thinks that you are releasable and that you are eligible for release, but you need to pay this amount of money to gain that freedom. And at least for misdemeanors, there's good precedence that says, it's presumptively unconstitutional if you're holding people for too long in jail, pre-trial, on a bond amount that they can't afford. When you start talking about felonies, it gets a little bit more complicated, but I think the basic premise is still there, that a court has determined that you're eligible for release. Otherwise, the court would not have set a bond. And the only thing preventing you from getting out is your inability to pay that amount. And if you are a person with means and with money, even if you were charged with armed robbery, burglary, whatever the felony is, and the judge sets your bond at $50,000, you're going to get out. You're going to be able to pay that $50,000. And And that has nothing to do with whether or not you can abide by release conditions or whether or not you're going to stay out of trouble as you await your court date. It just has to do with the fact that you can afford that $50,000 bond.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the disparities there are going to be racial because a disproportionate number of people of color are poor. But I think that really the people who are sitting in custody are there because they are too poor to post their bond.
And also keeping in mind that the reason that they're poor is not because they haven't tried hard enough or haven't worked hard or any of those things. That's also a result of
Right.
an oppressive system that we live in.
That's right.
Obviously,
I had two parents who worked harder. I had two parents who worked harder than anybody I knew growing up, and we were still poor.
Yeah, yeah. So, okay, so we're running short on time. I'd love to hear what it is that you are, thank you for, I know I've kind of asked you to go into like a lot of learning, but this system is so hard for people to understand who aren't really well versed in it. And it's like so big and so unknown. So thank you for demystifying it a little bit. What is some work that the ACLU Georgia is doing? I know you're, as I mentioned before, working on project to get some people released. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So the Georgia Constitution gives the parole board what I interpret as blanket authority to release people on parole who are 62 years old or older. And this comes from the state constitution that talks about the parole board's power and authority. And in that section, it says, notwithstanding any other limitations on the parole board's authority, they can release people on parole who are 62 years old and older. And as we learned more about this virus and learned that people with pre-existing chronic health conditions and people who are older are at risk of severe illness with COVID-19.
Can you repeat that last sentence again? I think the sound just cut out. So people who are older.
I actually got a notification.
Oh, okay.
So as the ACLU of Georgia learned more about COVID-19 and learned that people with pre-existing or underlying chronic health conditions, as well as people who were older, were at greater risk of severe illness if they were to contract COVID-19. We looked to see what were some of the release mechanisms available to the Georgia Department of Corrections, the Georgia Board of Pardons and Parole, courts, prosecutors, to see where we might be able to push on the lever to get people to release folks from jails and prisons. And we found that the parole board, there's already this contemplation that people who are at least 62 years old and older in prison are a vulnerable population. You know, why it's been included so explicitly in the Constitution, and in naming people who were 62 years old and older. And I think that was intentional by the drafters to say that these folks who are older and in prison are, more medically fragile. They require more help sometimes, medical attention. And so the parole board should have this power, this discretionary authority to release those people on parole when necessary. And that's true pre-COVID and post-COVID. The Georgia Department of Corrections and prisons all over the country have talked about the difficulty sometimes in continuing to house people in their custody who are older and have high medical needs. And so under COVID, of course, this is all exacerbated. People who are older, who already had these chronic health needs, are now at severe risk of developing and higher medical needs and death. And so we spread the word that the ACLU of Georgia has this hotline email, covid@acluga.org. And we asked people to write into us to tell us about the experiences of their loved ones and whatever concerns or observations they had made about facilities and their response to COVID. And we did hear back from loved ones who have family members who are 62 years old and older. We've gotten people who are in their 80s saying, I'm worried about my father or my brother. And is there a way that you can write the parole board and ask for their release? And so that's what we've done. We've written the parole board now, I believe, on 5 occasions, and another letter is going out this week on behalf of all men so far, on behalf of men who are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and asking the board to just release them on parole.
That's incredible. And are you doing this on a per person thing if you've heard from families, or are you able to do that and say like call for the full release, or you think it's more effective if you do it by per person?
So we, in each letter, we ask for the parole board, we continue to ask the parole board to just expand their scope of people that they're considering eligible for release to include those who are 62 years old and older. So we're asking for the broad release of people who are 62 years old and older, because the parole board announced that they were considering certain populations of people to release on parole.
Okay.
And we want them to include older people, 62 years old and older. But in addition to that, we do it on an individual basis. We
Okay.
ask for the broad release or the broad consideration, and then we narrow it and say, this person is one such person who you should look more carefully at, and for all of these reasons.
Okay. That's awesome. We're running a little over time. If you have time, I'd love to, are you able to share any of those stories to
Yes,
more of
yes,
like a personal?
yes, of course. So we have sent a letter on behalf of someone who is in his 80s and has chronic health conditions, underlying health conditions. He is in custody on a very small, limited sentence, I think a 3-year sentence, and is parole eligible. He has a TPM that's coming up very soon, I believe this summer. And so we asked the parole board to just expedite that review to see if, if you were already considering to release him in July or June, consider it now in April, because he is 80 years old and has these chronic health conditions, and we're under a health crisis. We also just sent a letter recently on behalf of someone who will be 63 years old this coming May, who has already contracted the virus. And his family members are very concerned. He's been serving over 25 years in custody and has missed already much of his life, much of his entire life, and the lives of his children. And now that he has contracted this virus, his family is, of course, concerned that he will forever miss the rest of his life and the lives of his children because he'll be dead.
Mm-hmm.
And he is at one of the prisons with the highest rates of confirmed cases of COVID-19 at Autry State Prison. And so it's urgent. And the parole board really needs to focus their attention on these facilities where it's a petri dish, for the people who are lying in wait and feel pretty useless in the face of this, or feel pretty helpless, I should say.
Right. Yeah. Because there's like nothing you can do, and like one day could mean that's like a big deal, especially right now. So, is that COVID at ACLUGA.org? Is that still? Can people still write into that if people they want to bring to your attention?
Yes.
And is there anything that people who don't know people in jail or prison, what can those people do to help raise awareness, advocate, help try to make a difference?
Yeah, I would encourage them. There are a lot of ways to stay involved. I mean, they can listen to our podcast, the ACLU of Georgia, but other organizations in Georgia who are doing this work, Southerners on New Ground is an excellent organization that works directly with people who are in custody or formerly incarcerated. They've had wonderful bailout campaigns trying to get people out of pretrial detention. I think they focus a lot of their work on Atlanta, but they've been all over the state, and that's a good organization to get plugged into.
Okay.
And I think, believe it or not, there are a lot of good Facebook groups that talk about the experiences of people in prison. And now, I don't know how much appetite people have in reading Facebook posts, and they can sometimes be infuriating, but it's worth it to see. I mean, that's where loved ones go and speak freely about the concerns that they have. And I think seeing that, you talked about this when we first began our conversation, being able to humanize the experience and know that this is happening to actual human beings, people's children and people's fathers and brothers and sisters, I think it does wonders in connecting people emotionally to the problem, such that it's no longer this intellectual idea
Hmm. Of other people. It's really easy
of other
to
people.
do
Right,
that. Like, oh, that's happening to those people because of what they did, and
right.
it's
And
nothing to do with them. Yeah.
it's been interesting talking to people. I have always known people who were involved in the criminal system, and I've always known about racism. And as a public defender, I've always known and recognized the humanity in violence. But I will. So sometimes I'm surprised when people don't see that as I do. But I have talked to people who have said, um, who are otherwise white and privileged, and this is, and when it does, when it's their son or their father, they say, I had no idea the system was this broken.
Hmm. Yeah, it is. It's amazing. And then when it happens to you, it's like, oh, now it's important. So, and that's sort of the crux of what I'm trying to do in general, is bring to attention stuff that even if it's not happening to you, it's still important. And the
Right.
people who it's happening to are human beings just like you are, and have all the same thoughts and feelings and emotions that you have, even if being raised in our society doesn't really teach you to realize that,
Yep.
because it's a consequence of being brought up in this society that makes people, brainwashes people sort of into having some of these beliefs that they have about people who are different from them, and
That's
that's
right.
what I'm trying to work on, and the work you're doing is incredible. So Kosha, I'll let you go. I've sort of dragged you 10 minutes over the time we were supposed to talk. So thank you for staying on a little later. The work you're doing is incredible. I will list these Southerners on New Ground, the ACLU podcast. I didn't know about that, so I'll find links for that. And are you on social media at all? Is there a place that people can follow you?
Well, I am, but not in any meaningful way. So they'd be disappointed if they would, if they were.
Okay. So more just following the ACLU and
Yes, yes.
the work you do there through following the ACLU.
Exactly.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for everything. Thanks for talking with me and for taking the time to explain things, to kind of like take it to a level that people who have not heard of these concepts can really understand and wrap their brains around. So thank you for that.
You're
And
welcome.
I hope you and your family stay safe and healthy. And thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.